Hello and welcome to the Authentic Uprising Show. I'm your host, Jill Simons. I am so excited to grow in the radical art of standing in what God says about you with you today. This show is a place where we pour into our concept of who we are, how we've been created with intention by God, and how we can live out of the freedom that He has for us more every single day. Hello, and thank you so much for being here with me today. I am so excited to chat with you about some new products that we have coming out for Pink Salt Rye, and specifically like the story behind the collection, because it is something that came to me so fully formed, and I think is such a beautiful analogy for us to use as we're really grappling with our approach to the spiritual life and how we look at really our role that God has for us. So this collection is called the Moon Collection. We've launched a couple versions of it in the past, and this is a revamped, updated version that I'm so excited about. We also have an amazing 5-day challenge that you can take called the Moon Challenge. The link is in the show notes that you can access in your podcast app or here on YouTube. And I really encourage you to sign up for it because it's a 5-day challenge to walk you through thinking about how much you really live out of this analogy. But I haven't even told you what it is yet, so I need to flesh it out before we get ahead of myself. So this idea of being the moon is a really, really powerful one because we understand, how the moon and sun work, right? So the sun generates light. It's our star of our solar system. And I have a 7-year-old who's like, unbelievably into stars and astronomy and all of that. So I know more about this than I ever thought that I would in my life, but it's been helpful actually for this analogy. So the sun creates the light in our solar system, and that's the only source of light in our solar system. But then we have the moon, right? And the moon is literally just a rock. Like, it's just a rock. It doesn't have anything else going on except being a rock. But it's in orbit around our Earth, and because of the magnitude of the light of the sun, that light hits the moon and reflects back onto us. And that's the same thing that happens with other planets. Frankly, Venus is very bright in the night sky frequently, and it's a planet, also just a rock, and it's because of the magnitude of the light of the sun. And because of the proximity of the moon to our planet, that's why it's so bright and able to actually light the night sky. And so I love this idea of thinking about us in our role as Christians as being the moon, because the moon doesn't have like merits of its own that bring about its light-giving properties. It's just in proximity to something with incredible light-giving properties that then it's able to really pass that on to then our Earth, where we are able to receive light from the moon because of the light it has received from the sun. And so, there's the obvious, like, almost cringy pun about the sun versus the sun, S-O-N, in Jesus. So I'll spare you, like, the full drawn-out version of that. But God is the only light, right? He is the sun in the universe of being. And it is only His light that is shared with us that we're able to then pass on to others. And I think that's just so interesting because, like, the cosmos could have worked literally any way. Like, they didn't have to be any certain way because they were designed by God. And so the fact that He gave us this image, I don't think is by accident, of course. It's this powerful image of how our correct disposition towards God is. And then when you look at the moon is able to light the night for half of the world and also creates the tides. Like, there's this real effect of the moon's position on the world. And I think this is, again, so similar to us, where like we are actually able to bring light to situations, but not because we've generated any light, but because we've passed it on. And we're also able to move the reality in situations because of our proximity to things. So for instance, if God puts you in a city, in a family, in a context, you have a real power to affect that because of the proximity he's placed you in to the people and things around you, just as he is sharing his light with you for you to then pass on. But then what happens, and you know, the analogy kind of breaks down here where it's not really one-to-one, but you see there's these phases of the moon where the earth gets between the moon and the sun. And because of that, the moon's light gets smaller and smaller. And I think, you know, it's funny when you think about it literally, like the world gets between you and God. It's like, well, that's kind of on the nose. But it's also kind of true where when we have worldly cares, worldly things, other things that interrupt the stream of light we're able to receive from God by getting between us and God, it diminishes the amount of light that we are able to share. And I just really, really like that analogy, in part because it also speaks to just aesthetically the space that I have chosen to position everything that I do, which is very much, we have a lot of like hippie, bohemian kind of people, which I just absolutely love, that will come in the shop and feel almost betrayed by the fact that it's Christian items, because there's this huge sense that, like, you know, rocks and the moon and macrame randomly and things like that are like the property of this hippie movement that is, in a lot of times, not always obviously, but in a lot of cases, grounded or at least adjacent to the New Age movement. And so why I do what I do, in part, is because this is my style, and I can love Jesus and love this style at the same time, but also because in a lot of ways, it doesn't make sense to me that we are not claiming these things as Christians, like the moon. This is such a beautiful, powerful symbol of our relationship to God when it's rightly ordered. And so, heck yes, let's embrace the moon. Let's, you know, have the moon on things. And yes, some people will just think it's a trendy thing. But if you have it in your mind that this is something that's tying you back to the correct disposition towards God, what a beautiful thing that is. Like, of course, do that. And that's really where I like to sit with my work, is like challenging those lines we draw on so many fronts, but especially on this front around like naturally occurring things and phenomena that are absolutely designed by God. And so there's not any reason to be afraid of them when they're rightly understood and rightly ordered. And obviously we don't want to ascribe a power to the moon that is not the moon's, that belongs to God. But as a symbol that ties us back to the truth of something, just like the cross as a symbol that ties us back to the truth of something, there's a lot of value there. And so in the collection, there's all kinds of cute, just like really actually adorable moon pieces that are packaged with a card that talks about this idea of just being the moon. And one of our taglines with that is reflect and remain. So that idea of abiding where God has placed you and then just sending back whatever he gives to you. And that is something that then to talk, you know, tie it into the message of the podcast here, you know, what does it look like to radically stand in what God says about you? God says that he wants you to be empowered to share his light. He wants you to be the moon reflecting these beams to those that need it. He doesn't want you to be hidden away and obscured and think that that's the humble thing to do. The humble thing to do is to be in a posture of abiding, first of all, not like seeking Like, how can we, like, oh, I really want my light to be the light that illuminates this place. I'm going to go over there so that I can be the one to bring about the light and the change in this place in kind of a grasping way. We abide where he's put us. And there's an acceptance and a posture of receiving there versus a posture of grasping. And then as we receive, we give, we reflect. And it's something that we are able to disentangle from like performing in any way because we came from a posture of receiving. And so that's really where I want you to reflect this week. And I want you to think about when you are doing the good, holy, light-giving things that you're doing, is that from a posture of like, oh, I want to do this because I want to be the one to give the light? Or is this from a posture of like, okay, I'm receiving what God is giving me, and then I can't help but share it because it was a free gift to me, so I want to give freely back? Ask that of yourself. Ask yourself that question. Be curious about your motives. I think I do about 50-50. Really. Like, I think about half of the time, I'm like, oh, but I really want to be the one. And that's a bad thing. Like, that's something I am actively working on. But at the same time, I don't want to let that be the thing that silences me from ever sharing something, from ever coming on this podcast, from ever speaking with you about this. Because at the same time, God has given me a lot of light to share. And so before I do something, like before I record this podcast, I pray specifically, like, Lord, help me to just reflect you. Help me to get out of the way. Because I get in the way a lot. I like put myself in the way. And when I do that, that ultimately gets in the way of him being able to share, of his light being shared to the extent that it could. And I've done this my whole life. And again, this is another thing where I don't talk to you from a place of like, back when I had this struggle. I still have to ask myself this question frequently because I am a Christian figure on social media. There's a ton of temptation to be like, oh, let me tell you how to do this thing, and make it sound like it's from this place of like perfection and doing it myself. But like a lot of things, you don't have to be perfect at something to be able to understand how it should work and be moving towards it working that way. Like, I used to love ice skating as a little girl, not doing it, but watching it. I was horrible at doing it. But I could explain to you quite well, like, how mechanically some things were supposed to work because I had watched so many competitions. And I had this good sense of how things were supposed to work. And it wasn't necessarily tied into having executed it myself at all versus even well. And so I hope that you take this then into your interactions with other people and really into a spirit of the benefit of the doubt when you are hearing from other people. Maybe this is like just me being like really struggle bus, but I struggle with Christians on social media to be like, when they're preaching, essentially sharing gospel. I don't mean that in a negative way, to be down on them for doing that at all, because I think there are so many that bring a lot of light. But it's really tempting for me to judge or to try and judge which position, which posture they are serving from. Whereas I don't know that. That's not my place to judge that. It's my place to receive what light is being shared. And if it's being shared imperfectly, okay, God can still use that if we're receptive to what is from him. And obviously we need to use a lot of discernment about this, because we don't want to be just following people that are giving us poor messages or something like that. But I think a lot of times it's really tempting to like try and poke holes in people that it seems like they are presenting themselves as a way that it seems like, are they really that way? Can they really be that way? And we don't know. At the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. We don't know. And what we do know is that truth is truth wherever we find it, because all truth is God's truth. If it's not the truth. And so we can be receptive to light wherever it is shared, but then we also really need to be reflective, pun not intended, about how we share our light. And so when you're going into a situation where there's an opportunity to share, there's an opportunity to minister, where there's an opportunity to sit with someone in a hard thing, to go into it with the disposition of, Lord, I'm going to try and get out of the way as much as possible. Like, push me out of the way if that seems necessary to you. Because don't like leave this all up to me to do this perfectly, because we won't. We need the grace, we need the strength, we need the fortification from God to really enter into what it is that He wants us to be able to do. And again, this comes right back to this theme we have on this podcast of like, how do we be free? And freedom comes from this position of receiving and this position of being open versus grasping and holding and pushing. So I just invite you, sit with that question. And if this is something that's really you're interested in, now would have been the time for me to mention the Moon Challenge. So that's what I'm going to do. If you head to the show notes in your podcast app or here on YouTube, you'll be able to sign up for this 5-day challenge that's going to walk you through really thinking about this, thinking about how you show up right now, how you want to show up in the future, and what you allow God to do in your life and what you are really grasping to happen. So I invite you to join along. You can click the link below to check that out. I would love to have you join us, and you can start anytime. So click on the link and join us in the Moon Challenge. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the Authentic Uprising podcast. If you're watching on YouTube or listening on a podcast app, make sure that you hit subscribe so that you can get all of our updates automatically in your app on YouTube. And we also ask that you leave us a review or a comment. If you're in a podcast app, leave us a review. That helps us get seen by more people. And on YouTube, leave us a comment. Let us know what you loved from the episode and send it on to a friend. I am sure that you know someone who really needs the message in this podcast from today. I also encourage you to check out Pink Salt Riot. That is my company that sponsors this podcast. We have an incredible online shop full of all kinds of beautiful and unique Christian lifestyle goods. You can shop our whole line at pinksaltriot.com. I'll see you next week.